everyone. Thanks for joining us today at the first short paper session of Virtual AERI 2022. It's very exciting. We have 3 papers by 𝐏𝐚𝐩𝐞𝐫𝐬, by Anna Robinson-Sweet, and one by Charlotte Im. So I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining from today, which is the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations here in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I acknowledge that it is unceded and stolen land, and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Indigenous people on the call today. There is just one note I need to mention as chair, and that is following the opening of the Virtual AERI 2022, AERI's new bylaws were ratified. This means transitioning from the interim board to a new steering committee. And there are 4 positions left to fill, and nominations are remaining open until Friday, the 16th of July. So please consider supporting the transition by joining the committee. The nomination information is on the listserv, and if you have questions around what it would involve, please contact Joanne Evans, and in a moment I'll put some links in the chat just in case they are of interest to anyone. But that is all the notes for the chair. So I will get us started with 𝐏𝐚𝐻. 𝐏𝐚𝐻 works at the University of Maryland, and she's here to present It's About Who's Been Missing, Investigating Gaps Between Theory and Practice of Social, Reparative and Restorative Justice Work in Academic Archives. Thanks, 𝐏𝐚𝐻.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm going to share my screen so you can hopefully see my slides. Can you see them? Cool. Do you have that weird view where you also see my notes? Excellent. Good. I did that right then. So thanks, Nicola. Yes, I'm 𝐏𝐚𝐻𝐞𝐫𝐬, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And thank you for coming to this talk today. Just before we get into the meat of it, I want to acknowledge that UMD and where I currently live are on the traditional and unceded lands of the Piscataway, Pamunkey, and 𝐏𝐚𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐬 peoples. So I also wanted to start this out by saying that this is very much a work in progress. We're going to be talking about my dissertation research, so I would love feedback and suggestions as we go along. So this project, It's About Who's Been Missing, Investigating Social, Reparative, and Restorative Justice in Academic Archives, like I just said, is my dissertation research project. This was essentially born out of an interest in documenting of a hate crime committed on the University of Maryland's campus right before I moved to UMD to start my program. Richard Collins III, who was then a senior at Bowie State University, which is an HBCU that's in the same state school system as UMD, it's about 11 miles away from UMD's campus, was murdered on UMD's campus in May 2017 by a UMD student who had ties to white supremacist groups. Immediately after Collins's murder, UMD students took to Twitter, posting about times in which they felt unsafe on campus due to their racial or ethnic identity, and they used the hashtag #FearTheTurtle. This is a phrase that is used as a rallying cry by the athletic department at UMD. UMD's mascot is a turtle, but it took on a new meaning in this context. And the image that's on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is the campus bus stop where Richard Collins was murdered on UMD's campus. And the genesis for me really wanting to get involved in this documentation project at UMD specifically. And might be hard to see on the images on this slide, but you can see it's a bus stop. And there's a sign up saying that now it's no longer a working bus stop. It kind of became a site of vernacular memory. So there's a picture of Collins in there. There are flags. He was an ROTC student, so he'd been commissioned into the Army already. He was supposed to graduate a week after his murder. There is actually now a permanent memorial dedicated to Collins on the campus that just opened up 2 months ago. So just over a year after Richard Collins was murdered on UMD's campus, in June 2018, a UMD football player named Jordan McNair died after getting heat stroke during a football practice in summer training. This heat stroke was not treated by football coaches and staff, which contributed to Jordan's death. The following fall, after Jordan McNair's death, when most students came back to campus, and summer is sort of a more deserted time on college campuses, students then organized protests that they called the Justice for Jordan protests, drawing an explicit connection between Richard Collins's murder and Jordan McNair's death on our campus. So the image on the left-hand side of this screen is a photo of the Justice for Jordan protest, and this appeared in the Diamondback, which is the student newspaper at UMD. And if you can see some of the signs up here that the students are holding, one of them explicitly references Lieutenant Collins as well, saying, "We remember Lieutenant Collins, Black students matter." But before I go more into Collins and Jordan McNair and the documentation projects that form part of my dissertation, let's take a step back and just talk about the American archival field today in 2022. So the roots of justice work in archives, which is an umbrella term that I use to kind of describe social, reparative, and restorative justice work, began in the late 1970s and early 1980s, with ideas of questioning who ends up being documented and how they are described in collections. I define social, reparative, and restorative justice in archives, for my purposes, to be any action that attempts to rebalance archival collections, access, and the historical record to include a wider range of experiences and viewpoints, specifically with an eye towards including traditionally minoritized or underrepresented groups, and aiding members of those groups to see themselves present and fairly portrayed in archives, in collections, as people, as practitioners. Because archives can vary widely in collections content, mission, user populations, there is no one-size-fits-all approach of justice work in archives. Rather, archival justice work can be seen as a contextually dependent lens that the archivist uses to attempt to do their work in a more just and better way. Keeping the context of a particular institution in mind is also key to understanding what justice would mean at that institutional archive. And there's some quotes on this slide of pieces that I found particularly useful as I'm writing my literature review for this dissertation. The Howard Zinn quote on this slide comes from a talk he gave to the Society of American Archivists in the 1970s, exhorting archivists to question neutrality and become activist archivists, workers who do not aim for neutrality or nonpartisanship, but shed professionalism as a shield and actively engage with the world around them. As he put it, to engage in rebellion against the norm. So even though I'm saying these ideas first started coming to the archival world in the 1970s and early 1980s, they did not necessarily take root at that time widely throughout the profession. There were other radical ideas being put forth around this time too, like Gerald F. Ham's proposal of post-custodial archives in 1981, and post-custodial archives take advantage of the then new role of computing in archives by allowing for archives to hold copies or surrogates of original items, allowing the original to be retained by the owner or creator. And even with these new ideas, American archival practice has remained fairly conservative and traditional up until recently. In 2006, when Rand Jimerson stated that archives are not neutral or objective, and that a key function of the archive is to hold organizations and individuals responsible by providing transparency to a wider public, archival literature had not yet embraced these tenets, and these ideas were still seen as sort of radical or fringe, not as the entire profession's viewpoint. In fact, when I was in school for my MLIS about a decade ago, archival justice work was very much still seen as a radical idea. It became more and more accepted as each year passed, but still very much an activity that could carry a great deal of risk to engage in. However, this past decade, there has been a pretty large paradigm shift within the field in terms of explosion of publication in archival literature on social, reparative, and restorative justice work within archives, and encouraging archivists to see justice as a key part of the work of the archivist. But despite this explosion in literature, is it permeating practice? What is happening on the ground at archives? Sorry, trying to go to the next slide and it doesn't want to let me do it. There we go. So that brings me to the research questions for my dissertation. And these are born out of I did a pilot test study with a few archivists working at University of Maryland about 2 years ago, and these helped form these questions. But basically, what the dissertation is looking at is overall, and to what extent, how are concepts of social, reparative, and restorative justice permeating archival practice on the ground at academic archives? What are the catalysts for changes happening in archives? What are motivating factors? What do archivists engaging in justice work see as their goals or successes? And what are the barriers to engaging in social justice, reparative justice, and other forms of anti-racist work within academic archives? How are social, reparative, and restorative justice work evaluated in academic archives? And here you can see the research methods I'm using to answer those questions. So the first part is a primary case study of the University of Maryland and the 1856 Project. And the 1856 Project, which I'll describe more on our next slide, is a very new project at UMD founded in 2020, which is when UMD joined the University Studying Slavery Consortium. So taking a quote from an email from Lael Hughes Watkins, who is UMD's university archivist and co-chair of the 1856 project. This project aims to build an inclusive university community by enhancing the collective understanding of the Black experience at UMD. Since it's a new project, using participant observation and interviews with people working on the 1856 project, I'll be able to understand kind of how a project like this starts at the beginning. What are the goals? What are the barriers they're hitting? Who's involved? What kinds of roles those people have? So that portion of the dissertation will include participant observation of the 1856 project meetings, interviews with participants and stakeholders from the 1856 project, and then an interview study with archival practitioners who work at UMD but are maybe not formally part of any of the 1856 project committees, just to kind of get as full of a picture as possible. And then all of this will be supplemented with an interview study with archival workers at other academic institutions who are engaged in archival justice work in order to try to triangulate the data I gather from UMD and compare, are there similar challenges? Are there differences in approaches? How much of this is due to structure of each archive? Like I mentioned before, contextually dependent lens is really important here, since what type of justice work you're doing and how that is designed will have a lot to do with what is the institution you're working at, what's the past of that place, what's the present. So why is UMD my primary case study? Obviously I'm a student there, but that's not the only reason I chose UMD. I did have connections that were easy to kind of get more of a rapport there, but towards the beginning of this talk, I mentioned the student reaction to the death of Richard Collins III on our campus. I'd like to circle back to that here by sharing some tweets that I screenshot, excluding the poster's handles, back in and then the summer of 2017, posted in that immediate aftermath of Richard Collins's murder by Sean Urbanski, who was the UMD student. I know UMD's University Archives has also captured these tweets. I'd like to just read a handful of them out to you quickly. For time, I'm not going to read all of them. But seeing these posts really reinforced my desire to understand how this hate crime would be documented and remembered by the campus community. So you can see here, UMD is not a safe place. Fear the turtle because Terps can be racist, homophobic, sexist, and even killers. Fear the turtle when the bus driver told Black students the bus was full, but let white students get on right after. This was a hate crime. This is 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 a hate crime. Fear the turtle. Reminder that Bowie State University as an HBCU was founded in part because PWIs like UMD wouldn't admit Black students. Fear the turtle. So you can see here a lot of students were seeing this murder as something that really lit a fire under them to expose what they had already been feeling but had often been kind of silenced at UMD. And this was also something that I was very interested in, with how is the university archives, university as a whole, going to grapple with what's going on this campus. So a bit more about the 1856 project. So this is another big reason why I chose UMD as the center part of that case study. So as I mentioned, it's a new archival justice project, and it's led by two library faculty members, Lael Hughes-Watkins and Joni Floyd. While other universities do have projects of a similar nature, it is not necessarily common for these projects to come from and be led by archivists and librarians. Further, the 1856 project has a very strong supporter in the university president, Darrell J. Pines, who announced this project and listed as a key anti-racism initiative in his administration as university president. So this level of vocal public support from the very top of the hierarchical university structure is not the case at most American universities. So the mission of this project, as taken from presentation materials, is, as University of Maryland's chapter of the International Consortium of the Universities Studying Slavery, the 1856 project supports campus efforts to build an inclusive university community by enhancing the collective understanding of the Black experience at UM. Broadly, we aim to investigate the history of the African-American experience on the campus and in the surrounding Maryland community, conduct detailed analysis of documentation identifying the university's historical connections to US slavery and its legacies, and disseminate our findings to campus stakeholders and to the public with clearly defined reparative outcomes. So this project's mission is part of what makes UMD such an intriguing case study. Founded as I had already begun exploring the role of justice work in archives, this project explicitly engages in the type of work archival literature has been calling for. And I'd like to pause here for a moment to talk about positionality. The research that I'm talking about today focuses on open discussion and examination of race, specifically within an academic institutional setting, with an eye towards justice. It's about who's been missing. Investigating social, reparative, and restorative justice in academic archives explicitly engages with the documentation or lack thereof of the Black experience at the University of Maryland. In any research, it's important for the investigator to examine the ways in which their own background and biases might impact the work. Who they are impacts what they study and how they study it. So I bring my background into all of the work that I'm doing, and it's important for me to reflect on the ways in which being a white woman shapes the work that I do and how I make relationships with people doing this work as well. I collaborate with and study people who have been deeply harmed by people who look like me, and I need to keep that at the forefront as I approach partnerships. In particular, when studying justice work at academic archives, I often occupy a space of insider-outsider. Insider in terms of the fact that I'm a former archival practitioner, and so I met some of the people who I interview for this study when we were both archivists at conferences. And I know the lingo and some of the difficulties of working in an academic institution, how those hierarchies work, things like that. So I feel like an insider to a certain extent, but I'm an outsider because I don't work at this university archive or the other ones that I'll be studying and never have. And these can bring a host of challenges occupying kind of both of those spaces. It's a delicate balance, and I aim to maintain as much trust and openness with my study subjects as possible. And to be honest about the fact that my purpose in conducting this research is neither to ameliorate the institution by promoting archival justice work being undertaken at UMD as an end-all solution for the issue of racial justice on campus, nor is it to expose or paint the institution in a negative light, but rather to better understand the pioneering archival justice work being undertaken by UMD archivists and other folks. It's important to note that researching these issues can carry a political and employment risk for some. But as a white woman, that risk is lower for me than for many others who would like to do this work. So I hope to wield the privilege that I have to shed light on some of the realities of archivists doing this type of work, particularly justice work focused on anti-racism and the Black experience. So I mentioned earlier that I had done a pilot interview study a few years back with a small set of archival practitioners selected using proportive sampling. In addition to help shape the interview protocols for the ongoing dissertation interviews, some interesting early themes emerged from this set of data. And I'm going to only touch on these quickly because I don't want to run out of too much time. But these early interviews showed that there certainly is a lag in adoption of justice work in archives, despite the wealth of archival literature describing the need and arguing for social justice as a lens in an archival imperative. So there is a gap between that theory and practice, right? And that individual archivists engaging in this type of justice work reported that it was often seen by their superiors or their coworkers as an individual choice rather than a key part of their job. So they would say things like, you know, you're not prevented from doing this work, but you're being told, you do this because you care about it, not because it's part of your job or it's necessarily a strategic initiative of your department, but more that, you know, you're carrying this whole thing on your shoulders. If you stopped your work there, what would happen to the things you had done, the relationships you had built, right? There are definitely issues around sustainability of initiatives because of that. So that idea of being tied to individual interest or choice rather than a delineated job function means that if that archival employee who is doing that work leaves the institution or goes to a different job, does the work and the relationships built with it just completely die? There also does seem to be a pattern of women of color, particularly Black women, taking on the majority of labor around social, reparative, and restorative archival work, similar to what you see in literature on higher education, diversity, and inclusion initiative work. So more data needs to be honest before I can conclusively say this, because this was a pretty small sample size, but I expect to see more as I continue the interviews for this project that can either back that up. And also importantly, after George Floyd's murder and the related demonstrations that happen worldwide, we are actually seeing swift movement in the acceptability of proclaiming Black Lives Matter as an institutional value at multiple schools. While this has acted as a lever for change, will that change be sustained and long-term, or will it result in spurts of research and initiatives that are ultimately ignored or used only as a shield against criticism of a university's culpability? It's really hard to say at this point. That's something we might not know for years or decades. And another thing I wanted to point out with is, as I engage in this work, it's important to bring an ethic of care to this. So as Rachel E. Winston wrote in her recent piece, Praxis for the People, Critical Race Theory and Archival Practice, in order for archives to move towards justice, they need to operate out of a commitment to minimize harm and provide care for both collections and professionals. Influenced by the feminist ethic of care, critical race praxis in archives should focus on both collections and people, acknowledging the human element present in collections, including the labor and emotion of archivists. We must extend care beyond the boxes, folders, and server space in our repositories. And this ethic of care centers relationships, which is really important for my project, given the subject matter I research and the communities that I'm working with. So it's important to establish equitable partnerships. Each party should get value out of working with each other and share in the credit and the accolades. To that end, when it comes time for me to publish this work more widely after completing my dissertation, it was very important for me to not just mention my research partners in acknowledgements, but give them a first right of refusal in co-authoring any work going forward. And I'm not going to touch into all this because I'm running out of time, but there are a few ideas for future work here. So one of the things I've been working on in my literature review is connecting, not just reviewing the archival literature on justice work, but connecting that with organizational studies and examining archives as institutions themselves, how change happens within institutions, and also racial structures within institutions, connecting it to critical race theory and connecting a bit to surveillance studies. Archives themselves are a form of surveillance. This is doubly complicated by a history of surveillance and policing of non-white people. So there's a lot of sources I've been looking into there. But I'm going to wrap it up because there's too much to include in all of this, but we can do questions now.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'll do the virtual Zoom clap on behalf of everyone because you can't really get the applause otherwise. If anyone has a question, you're welcome to unmute and ask it. Otherwise, if you want to pop it in the chat, we can also do it there.
I'm going to stop sharing so it's easier to see everyone.
That's all done. What we might do is move to the next presentation just so that we keep on time and have a few questions at the end, I hope. So if you're thinking about a question, put it in, maybe mark it for Caitlin, and then we can get to that. So I might move us on to Anna. Anna Robinson-Sweet is a PhD student at UCLA, and she is talking on picturing the police officer with his pen, photography, and the carceral archive. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Let's move this over. Great. So I'm Anna Robinson-Sweet. I'm a PhD student at UCLA, like Nicola said. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I am an unwelcome guest on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva people. And I will be presenting today on this paper that is still a work in progress. So look forward to hearing thoughts or feedback, hopefully in the Q&A. So the title of this paper is Picturing the Police Officer with Their Pen, Photography in the Carceral Archive. In this photograph from the early 1960s, two police officers stand out in the darkness, poised to open a door grasped by one of the men. The other stands with notepad and pen, documenting the situation and what they will presumably find on the other side of the threshold.
Anna,
this photograph,
we're not seeing the photograph properly. I don't know if you want to stop sharing and start sharing again, because I know we didn't have this problem when we tested it.
Yeah, let me try that. Okay. How's that? Good? Okay, cool. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so this photograph tells a story about the creation of a record, and in particular, the creation of a police record. In the US, such records, along with other technologies of law enforcement, have recently been the subject of increased scrutiny as scholars, organizers, and advocates attempt to understand and dismantle the enormous police power that has accrued over the past century. At the same time, photography and its derivatives, film and video, has come to be seen as a tool of accountability without consideration for the ways that these have been potent technologies of law enforcement. Photography such as the one seen here, photographs such as the one seen here, provide an example of the police's propagandistic use of photography, and in particular, the use of photography to promote police record-making power. In what follows, I critically analyze a collection of archival photographs of police engaged in making records to argue that in the US, photographic archives are crucial to the construction of what Tanya Sutherland calls carceral narratives, because of how they extend the power of police records to administer violence. So I'm approaching this topic as an archivist, of course, and also as an abolitionist. And I will argue that there is a tripartite collaboration between the police record, its depiction in the photographs, and the archiving of these images in place of the record itself. This collaboration produces what legal scholar Dean Spade refers to as administrative violence. This is Spade's term for the violence of state neglect, which is inflicted not through blows or blades, but by forms and checkboxes that determine vulnerability and security through the, quote, production and implementation of racism, xenophobia, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and ableism under the guise of neutrality, end quote. For example, Spade explains how trans people face exclusion from social welfare programs because of their inability to conform to the gender they were assigned at birth, leading many to premature death through poverty, illness, or violence. Law enforcement and incarceration are often framed as caretaking programs that address the risk of crime, but are in fact a means of criminalizing those who do not meet the state's norms. The technologies used to administer violence are those of classification and control. Critical archival studies scholar Tanya Sutherland calls out the crucial role of records in administering violence by providing the evidence to, quote, legitimize the power to punish. Sutherland names these records the Carceral archive, an archive that is created, called upon, and maintained to justify the incarceration of predominantly Black people and other people of color. These archives get mobilized in what Sutherland calls carceral narratives, those stories that uphold and propagate the state's disciplinary power. Sutherland writes that the state must continually tell these stories in order to, quote, serve the fiscal needs of the penal project and to maintain the racialized norms of an oppressive and carceral society, end quote. In this paper, I'm concerned with photographs of police creating records and their presence in the archive and how they tell a carceral narrative that upholds and furthers the police record's potency in administering violence. So the relationship between the police photograph and the record is made visible in these photographs that I'll be discussing, which were all taken by Southern California press photographer Milton Bell during the 1950s through 1970s. I first encountered Bell's work in a small collection of police promotional material at USC Special Collections and tracked down a larger collection of his work at a historical society in Monrovia, California, which is where Bell's studio is located. A substantial subset of the photos depict officers in the act of creating records. A few examples you can see here. In contrast, there are very few prints showing officers making an arrest and only a couple where the police deploy their gun. Either by choice through staging photographs or through chance, police work is shown as record making in Bell's images. This conforms with anthropologist 𝐏𝐚𝐩𝐞𝐫𝐬's argument that in bureaucratic societies, writing and documentation are not merely a byproduct of other actions, but themselves constitute the state. Indeed, policing was undergoing a bureaucratic transformation during this era, Bell's era of policing, as police professionalism reformers pushed for the implementation of procedures such as detailed reporting and forensic inspection. The emphasis that Bell's images place on recording demonstrates a shift from law enforcement as an exercise in force to one of information control. In many of Bell's photographs, officers take notes in the immediate aftermath of violence. For example, in this photo, the blood appears to be still wet on the victim's arm as the cop holds his pen and notepad. The victim looks expectantly at the officer, who seems to be able to discern what he and we cannot. This image was printed on the front page of Monrovia's Daily News Post, alongside an article that described the incident, just as the victim had recounted it to the officer. In the context of their circulation as news photographs, these images can confound our understanding of who writes the news, the reporter or the cop, while the captions and short articles that run alongside read as straightforward accounts of the crime as they would be relayed to the police. The reproduction of the police records narrative in the media firmly establishes law enforcement as what Stuart Hall and other authors of Policing the Crisis called the, quote, primary definers of events. From this position of power, any contradictory account faces an uphill battle, further entrenching the primacy of law enforcement's ability to control the record and the discourse. Bell portrays police record making as immediate and responsive to the facts presented to the officer. For example, in this photo, a cop inspects a crash with one hand and the other holds his clipboard, suggesting a direct correspondence between observation and recording. However, scholars from archival studies argue that law enforcement record keeping is hardly a direct transcription of fact. For example, Karen Trace observes in their analysis of law enforcement record keeping how knowledge about how and what to document is shared among police officers in anticipation of the record's future use. This record making is performative and intended to justify the police's own actions and to result in criminal conviction in cases where that is the purpose of the record. In a chilling example of this, Jarrett Drake just recounts the police manipulation of records in the aftermath of a deadly police shooting in New Orleans. After firing at 6 unarmed Black men, killing 2, New Orleans police officers created records that conformed to the narrative of legally justified state murder. Drake describes, quote, the use of descriptive devices in these police reports, such as the waistband shooting script, wherein the officer's reported observation of non-threatening body movement is enough to justify murder. In this way, the police report contributes to what Gabriel Solis calls the state's symbolic annihilation, a process that provides the basis for actual annihilation by the state. As Solis says, the dehumanizing descriptions found in law enforcement records, criminal justice proceedings, and media narratives, quote, reveal a foundational logic in dominant ideas of justice. Killing conceptually makes it much easier to kill actually or justify a killing in the aftermath, end quote. So critical archival studies scholars describe the police record as a tool of self-preservation and violence rather than crime solving. Bell's photographs, on the other hand, promote trust in the record by depicting the record's creation. If we have seen the record being made, how can we question its veracity? The relationship between photograph and record has deep roots. Art historian John Tagg explains that both of these are technologies of representation and were central to the development of carceral systems. A notable moment in the shared history came in 1897 with French police clerk Alphonse Bertillon's invention of the mugshot and corresponding filing system for classifying and identifying criminals. Beginning in this era and extending to the present, photographic technologies have inordinate power in Western legal systems as demonstrative evidence that is allowed to speak for itself. Tagg argues, however, that there is nothing inherent in the technology that establishes photography's evidentiary power, but rather its deployment by the state apparatus. This is photography's regime of truth, a term Tagg borrows from Foucault to describe, quote, that circular relation which truth has to the systems of power that produce and sustain it, and to the effects of power which it induces and redirect it, end quote. Essentially, because the state accepts photography as evidence, it has evidential power. In Bell's images, the photograph's regime of truth is transferred to another technology of representation, the police record. In at least some of the images, this transference is calculated. A decision was made by either the subjects, the photographer, or both in collaboration to stage images of police record making. So in this photo, 3 cops gather around a doorknob, and they're clearly frozen mid-action, waiting for the photographer to take the picture. So police work, again, is favorably shown to be the domain of experts who are using specialized techniques to transform the indiscernible, the inexplicable, and the chaotic into hard evidence. The men crowded around the doorknob in this photo see what we cannot. One officer holds a clipboard angled towards the viewer, presumably recording these clues to make them legible, but the flash's bulb renders the paper a bright spot of emptiness. None of Bell's images of police record making reveal the record itself. The photographs offer only a simulacrum of transparency. The viewer is invited into the police's work, but withheld from knowledge of its content and consequences. This inaccessibility is perpetuated in the archive, where documents such as police records are rarely retained for more than a few years. Those documents that are retained or still in active use are held in custody by the agencies themselves and can often only be obtained through Freedom of Information requests. While government agencies continue to draw upon their corpus of documents to administer care and violence, the general public can only gain access to materials like photographs, personal papers, and a sliver of bureaucratic documents. In this sense, the carceral archive is constituted through absence and inaccessibility as much as it is by presence and preservation. At the Monrovia Historical Society, Bell's images are the representation of local policing in the mid-20th century. So here are some images from there. His images cover the walls of an exhibition on the local police department, accompanied by displays showing the evolution of police technology. This exhibition is itself the culmination of the Historical Society's displays. The endpoint the end point of an exhibition corridor that begins with the first permanent white settlers, continues to the arrival of the railroad, then to the introduction of citrus farming, then to historical dioramas of an early 20th century home and schoolhouse. This is a story of white settler colonialism climaxing in professionalized law enforcement. Bell's photographs help impart this narrative in their portrayals of a cooperative white populace interacting with a white police force. The images and the historical society are notable in their absences: the absence of people of color, the absence of conflict, and the absence of the records themselves that administered violence to Indigenous people, Mexican people, and Black people who lived in this community. The records being created by the police in Bell's photographs fed a system of documentation that continues to incarcerate predominantly these populations. Sutherland describes how the carceral state draws upon historical and contemporary documents and data to administer violence by using such records to set bail, determine parole, and make sentencing decisions. The carceral archive makes these records inaccessible to those outside the state apparatus, but enshrines their use in determining life chances through carceral narratives like the ones presented at the Monrovia Historical Society. Unseen in Bell's photographs is the impact of such records: the dawn of mass incarceration that would transform Los Angeles County, where Monrovia is situated, into the capital of imprisonment with more people detained than anywhere else in the country. In the archive, Bell's photographs are surrogates for the records that administered this violence. The potency of Bell's work derives from its form and the inherent trust placed in things depicted with the camera. While photographic technology is hailed as a means of accountability for police violence, the reification of this kind of evidence must attend to the use and manipulation of the technology by state apparatuses. It is in the archive that regimes of truth undergirding the record and the photograph might be uncovered and disassembled. Indeed, if archives are to be liberatory instead of carceral, they should be sites for the critical interrogation of not just those records that directly inflict administrative violence, but of photographs and other materials whose carceral narratives support their power to do so. That's it for me. Thank you all. Look forward to questions after Charlotte.
Thank you, Anna. That was great.
Yes.
Most appreciated. So our final presenter in the session is Charlotte Im, who is a PhD candidate at University College London, and she will be presenting the construction and influence of information trustworthiness within social movements, a PhD project in progress. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you, Nicola. Let me remember how to share screen again. Just did that before the session and I've already forgotten. So good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here, especially for those in the UK who are still up at this hour. Unfortunately, I have fallen ill last week, so if I do start coughing halfway, do forgive me. My presentation today is titled The Construction and Influence of Information Trustworthiness Within Social Movements. Now, why did I bring this research here when it doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the archive or the record-keeping sector? I came from this sector myself, and although this PhD research is rooted more in the information and social movement space, I believe that there are lessons from our research that can be and should be applied to archives and the archival sector. First, let me introduce my research. In my PhD, I aim to understand the complexity of how information trustworthiness is constructed within social movements, and how its subsequent dissemination and comprehensions influences perceptions of trust and trustworthiness among social movement actors, with a particular focus in social media and the digital space. Within our sector, we discuss the authenticity of records. What ascertains the authenticity of a record lies in its provenance and archival description, but this is not easily accessible or comprehensible by the regular user. In a Dickinsonian ideal of an archive and an archivist's role, an unbroken chain of custody reassures the user and the custodian that a record is unaltered, traceable, and thus authentic. The regular user, who has little idea about the procedures or processes used in archives to guarantee authenticity, thus rely on the archive and the archivist to act as the assessor and guarantor. In their 2017 paper, Sexton et al. Describes this as a three-way relationship between the trusted record, the trusted custodian, and the trusted repository. Yet the idea of an archive as an authentic institution in itself can be challenged. In her 2012 paper, Max states that absolute certainty about the authenticity of a source is impossible, and that it could never be more than an informed opinion. Authenticity, no matter in whatever context, is just a framework to assess, evaluate, and bestow importance onto records or materials, serving as a justification of social order that is context dependent. Thus, authenticity is a scale or degree rather than a binary of authentic versus inauthentic, as any evidence that proves authenticity can only be suggestive, as we will never know if it's objectively true. Definitions of authenticity across different academic fields involve words such as originality, integrity, reliability, credibility. Yet all these words in themselves seem nothing more concrete than the concept of authenticity in itself. What makes up integrity or credibility? How can we ascertain the originality or reliability of a certain object or fact? Perhaps then we should be talking about authenticity perception rather than authenticity, given the impossibility of achieving a unifying or defining marker in one field, let alone across multiple. What is authentic is only in so much so because we believe that it's authentic. Our measures or dimensions of authenticity are informed by societal parameters, and in turn, we apply our own authenticity perceptions on things in order to evaluate them. It remains that the idea of the archive being an authentic institution is questionable. To what degree is an archive guaranteed to be authentic? What dictates the authenticity of an archive? Without that security of knowing that an archive is authentic, what can we then rely on to ascertain the authenticity of records and information? And how do we then convince the depositor of the records or the user of our services that the records we hold are authentic and thus worthy of trust? Authenticity is meaningless without trust, which returns the point of the discussion back to trust and trustworthiness. To understand my research question, I chose social movements as my case context, and I chose the Hong Kong protests from 2019 onwards and Black Lives Matter from 2020 onwards to study. The Hong Kong protest that began in 2019 was sparked by the proposed legislation of the Extradition Law Amendment Bill, and was sustained by reported cases of extreme police brutality and other acts of oppression that spread across social media. Meanwhile, Black Lives Matter stemmed from the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, developing into the hashtag that has come to represent a global social movement, and once again was brought to attention in 2020 with the death of George Floyd. In terms of similarities, what makes them uniquely suited for this study on trust and trustworthiness is the very visible digital presence of both movements, the prominence of the citizen journalists and the citizen participants, and the subsequent emergence of counter-narratives by government and other institutional forces, also making use of digital technology. In terms of differences, Black Lives Matter is an ideology that hopes to evoke fundamental changes in societal and institutional values, primarily in Western democratic countries. It is thus more or less a broad education and advocacy movement that can be echoed in multiple cultural and historical contexts. The Hong Kong protest, however, is a localized movement opposing what they perceive as authoritarian rule in East Asia. Largely pragmatic and programmatic, the end goal of the various strands in the protest revolves around Hong Kong gaining some form of political power and autonomy. By choosing two timely cases that share base similarities, but differ wildly in cultural contexts, I hope to be able to apply my research in different situations and approach it from different perspectives. Similarly, I believe it is the archive's role to help preserve the history of social movements, especially given the fleeting nature of digital activism, as is seen in both of my case contexts. The how is perhaps a conversation suited for dedicated research, but trust and trustworthiness is going to be part of that conversation. How do we convince social movement participants that we are equipped and are prepared to honor the legacy in light of their distrust of institutional forces? First, we must understand how they perceive trust. There is a whole field of trust literature that spans across various fields, including psychology, philosophy, politics, economics, computer science, etc. One possible definition is from Meyer, Davis, and Sherman, who argue that trust is the willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party, based on the expectation that the other will perform a particular action important to the truster, irrespective of the ability to monitor or control that other party. Trust can be understood both as an active and passive behavior. One makes active decisions to trust another, but may also possess passive subconscious trust in elements where uncertainty has been eliminated. Trust is thus also understood as a mechanism to cope with risk by excluding certain possibilities. Simmel describes its function for an individual as a hypothesis certain enough to serve as a basis for practical conduct, evidencing how trust is linked to decision-making. Different fields have different explanations as to why we trust. Rational theory suggests that trust is based on the logic of consequentiality. That is, individuals make judgments to trust based on the information that they have access to in order to achieve an optimal outcome. In the field of computer sciences, trust is defined through measurable quantifiers generated through rigorous calculations and tests. Non-rational approaches lean into affective and emotive bases of trust, including elements of faith, morals, or adherence to social norms. 𝐏𝐚𝐩𝐿 introduces the term motivated reasoning, which is the propensity of individuals to trust in things that align with prior beliefs. Trustworthiness, thus, is defined as having the potential quality of being trusted, and that is where the archive sits. To trust is an action initiated by the truster. There is nothing the trustee can do to force the truster to engage in trust. While individuals may attempt to look more trustworthy, and as the archive we try to talk about concepts that thus ensure that we have provenance, that we have authenticity, it is ultimately the truster's decision as to whether or not they engage in trust. I take the argument of Müllering that there is no one theory of trust which can be all-encompassing, because trust differs from individual to individual based on their experiences and circumstances, and thus should always be understood subjectively. It is only useful to an individual to understand the concept of trust while rooting it in particular contexts and taking into account the influence of these circumstances to the individual. What my research aimed to uncover is thus the formation of perceptions of trustworthiness when one is embedded within social movements. It is concerned with how people perceive their own decisions to trust, rather than why they trust. In literature surrounding social movements and their use of the internet, we can see that social movements are commonly seen as a space that nurtures collective sentiment and identity that ultimately leads to action, and are often politically and emotionally charged, as participants have individual stakes or reasons of which to support and take part in activities that confronts the status quo. In the digital age, many social movements have increasingly made use of social media or microblogging platforms to mobilize collective action, spread their message, build networks with other activist groups, and reach new audiences. Bennett and Segerberg describes this as the logic of connective action, where communication becomes a new form of organization due to digital technology, thus negating a need for formal organizational structures or collective identity, as individuals are able to develop personal action frames that motivate them to take part in social movements. In contemporary social movements, the information disseminator is also often the information recipient. As network communities are formed on the digital space, information flows between them in a much freer manner than in conventional methods of information sharing, enabling communications and thus records that don't rely on traditional power structures or hierarchies that enable collective mobilization. Castells uses the terms networked politics and networked social movements to describe how protest activity between separate networks coalesce into interconnected structures of organization and information flow. However, at any point in the flow of information, a piece of information can be added to, altered, destroyed, or even revived by everyone, thus transformed from what left the original disseminator's hands. It is then the right of the information recipient or the user to determine whether or not the information is trustworthy, and then decides if the degree of trust they have in the information they received is sufficient to then take further action. This is where my PhD research comes in. I am conducting a mixed methods study that begins with a social network analysis phase, which explores how information networks are created on social media. This will be followed by surveys and interviews that aim to explore how social movement actors create perceptions of trust and trustworthiness, and in the end, hopefully come up with a definition of trust that is applicable to them and is useful to them, rather than simply focusing on trust theory that is disconnected with what is happening on the ground. I'm not going to go into too much details about the methods, but do feel free to get in touch later on if you have any questions about this. The concept of information trust is one of ongoing debate and discussion, and is defined or perceived differently by different fields of study. With the proliferation of misinformation within contemporary political events and social movements, it is even more pressing to ask how we can best navigate this information landscape. How is trust and trustworthiness being understood and evaluated by individuals in particular contexts? How is it shaped by or shapes the context of study? If we cannot understand how people truly perceive trust and trustworthiness, how do we then move forward in our research and preservation of internet-driven activism? Apologies, the cough is coming. So, what does this all mean for archival research? It is no longer sufficient for us to say that the archive as an institute or the archivist as an individual is capable of guaranteeing authenticity and provenance. Terms like these are meaningless to the layman. If our audience or our user cannot put trust in the archive or the archivist, it doesn't matter what we think of our own records and practices. It is up to the individual to decide to put their trust in the archive, and then, by proxy, trust that the records within the archive are authentic. Thus, we have to bring forward discussions around archival trust and authenticity with the user in mind. With evolving digital infrastructures, digital records have become more and more commonplace, and we need to start thinking about how we can best preserve and present information in a way that is convincing and meaningful to the user. Interdisciplinary communication is necessary to create record-keeping practices that is satisfactory not only to the archive, but also to the user and to the depositor. It would be unwise for us to look at our solutions one-sidedly, without considering the implications of our decisions and our perceived authority on the very users that make meaning out of the records we keep. And this is where I'm going to end my presentation before my throat tries to murder me again, and I welcome any questions.
Thanks, Charlotte. Most appreciated, and I hope you're all right. Not choking over there. That's good. Thank you to all three presenters. They've all been really interesting papers, and I really appreciate it. Again, if anyone has any questions, please put something in the chat or join the discussion. I guess I was just reflecting on the fact across all kind of three papers really, and it goes back to one of Caitlin's comments where she mentioned that, is it permeating into practice and things? And given all the papers kind of cover social justice and truth and power and trust and all these kind of really core issues around archives, I was kind of wondering how you hoped that the work that you're doing now might support that move in practice moving forwards. If anyone wants to have a go at that.
I can start. So a couple of different ways that I hope this work will help support that movement is ideally I can help provide a model for how to potentially overcome barriers to engaging in archival justice work as a practitioner by studying how people are trying to do it now and what barriers they're hitting. I'm hoping that that will come out of it. I know one thing that the community I'm working with, and particularly the co-chairs of the 1856 project, had talked to me about is that they would really hope the type of partnership we're trying to do with each other could also potentially be a model for how to ethically engage in research of and with projects like the 1856 projects. The idea of like, we're very concerned to be like, I'm not going to come in as a vulture, pick out all of your good stuff and then publish it under my name, right? So they were like, oh, that would actually be very helpful for us if we can say, like, anytime a researcher comes to us and they are approaching us potentially not with that mindset, that we can be like, look at this paper, please work with us as deeply as this, right? So hopefully that's how things go too. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Did anyone else want to respond to that?
I mean, mine is less, I guess, sort of practical than the other papers or the other presentations. But I mean, it would be great if the Historical Society that I discussed like took those photos down and dismantled their police exhibit. But probably not going to happen. Just thinking about, you know, how as archivists, our approach to understanding the record, you know, I think it's more of like an intervention that we can make in other fields, like bringing our perspective to just, you know, whether it's the media or other, you know, social science fields that kind of accept these records as evidence or as sort of like a straightforward document. So just kind of trying to trouble that as much as possible.
I'll just add on quickly before myself tries to kill me again, that the communication, as I've mentioned, is very key, because especially with social movements, there are many community archivists that try to preserve social movements and try to preserve that legacy. But in the reality is individuals don't always have a good reason to trust institutions such as archives. They'll say, where are you taking my records? Where are you taking these things that mean very much to me? So I think what my research hopes to do is to bridge that gap between how can we understand how they understand us, essentially, because it's not useful for us to say, this is what we do things, this is our authority, without that being translated to the users in a way that they understand and that they can accept. Or else there's always going to be a divide. There's always going to be that kind of misunderstanding between us and the user, which is not helpful at all.
And I think that's a very pertinent comment there, Caitlin, that they often have good reasons not to trust the archive. Absolutely. Absolutely. Given there's only a minute or so to go, I don't want to keep anyone longer than they need to be here and make sure that Charlotte doesn't injure herself with her cough. So I think I will wrap it there. Thank you so much for all the presentations. Your research is incredibly interesting, and I think we all look forward to seeing it presented in other places as you progress through with your PhDs. So good luck with those, and thank you very much for all your wonderful presentations. I hope you enjoy the rest of Virtual AERI. Thank you.
Thanks.